Yo, what's up guys? Welcome back to my YouTube channel. I know I've been missing from YouTube a lot, but today I have a basic tutorial of Lightroom for you. So we're just going to cover through my basic workflow of how I'm going to edit my photos in Lightroom. But just take note, this video is going to be very basic. It's just going to cover the basic functions of how I go through when I edit my photos. And don't worry, so in the future I'll definitely be putting out more videos where we go more in depth into Lightroom and I will go through my full editing process. But without further ado, let's jump straight into Lightroom. Okay, so now we're in Lightroom, and as you can see on the right hand panel, we have all the adjustments available for you to use. And I'm just going to run you guys through how I usually edit my photos, and this is just going to be very basic, so we're just scratching the surface on Lightroom. So what I typically do is, when I'm beginning at it, I will go into lens controls, lens corrections, and I would remove chromatic aberrations as well as enabling my profile correction. So if you record your metadata when you're shooting in your camera, Lightroom will actually recognize what kind of lens you're using. So for this photo in particular, I was using the Canon EF 16-35 f2.8. So just enabling profile correction, it just removes the barrel distortion and the vignette around the photo. So right after the lens correction panel, I will go into the transform tab, and this is where I usually make my adjustments to correct the perspective of my images. And just clicking on this little icon right here, which is the guided upright tool, and this allows you to draw up to 4 guides on your photo to customize perspective correction. So I'm just going to show you what that means. So you want to find horizontal and vertical lines that you know in your image are straight. So in this particular image, I'm just going to draw one at the top here, making sure it's straight along. And then I'll find one at the bottom, maybe somewhere around here. And it corrects the horizontal axis of the image, but of course the vertical axis are not corrected yet, so I would go ahead and do that. So I'm just connecting points where I know it's in the middle of the image. So in this case, it's the line in between the escalators and this middle right here on the top. Okay, and I think everything is sort of in perspective. Right after that, I would go into the crop. And Instagram has a maximum aspect ratio of 4:5, so that's what I'm sticking with. If you're uploading your images on somewhere else, it may vary, but most of the time I'm usually uploading my stuff on Instagram, so this is what I usually do, keeping it to 4:5 aspect ratio. And a little tip that I want to mention right here is, if you click O on your keyboard, Lightroom will show you the different variations of grids that you can use. So you have like the golden ratio and stuff like that. But the one that I usually rely on is this one, which it tells me where the center of the image is. So all I have to do is just align the middle line onto the middle of the escalator, and I know my image is centered. So click enter there, and everything looks perfect to me. Okay, this is where we are going to go into the color correction of the image. So the exposure looks fine to me. I'm just going to bump up the contrast a little bit, reduce the highlights to just get back information in the sky. Shadows look fine to me, but I'm just going to raise it up a little bit and perhaps bring down the blacks, boost a little bit of the whites. And for me, I usually don't touch texture. I used to love to just boost the clarity in my images, right? But for now, I normally go into -10. So for those of you that don't know what clarity does, is if you bump up the clarity, it will increase the exposure around the edges of your image. So if you have like sharp edges, notice the lines in this photo, just boosting it makes it more crisp and it feels a lot more grungy. But most of the time, that's not what I'm really going for. So I just want a really soft, natural feel. So I'm keeping it at -10. And vibrance and saturation, I'll leave it as it is because it looks okay to me for now. And this is where things get kind of interesting. I know a lot of you guys might be thinking where the tone curve is very intimidating, and don't worry, I will definitely emphasize how I go about using the tone curve in future videos. But for now, let's just keep it really simple. So I'm just going to briefly explain to you the different functions you can do in the tone curve. So right on the top, you can see there's a Luma button, and then you have your red, green, and blue channel. So today we're just going to focus on the Luma. And what this tone curve basically shows you is you have your black point here and your white point here. So if you're moving this around, it's just adjusting the exposure of your image. But the difference between using the tone curve as compared to like the basic functions in the panel above, where you can control like the highlight, shadows and stuff like that, the tone curve allows you to have more flexibility because you can put points anywhere on the tone curve and you can adjust them to whatever needs that you may have if you want to edit your photos. So I'm just gonna create a very basic S-curve. This creates more contrast. So as you can see, when I put a button, when I put a point here and I reduce it, it's just controlling the shadows and the darker parts of the image. And for the one above here, this is just adjusting the brighter parts of the image. And for those of you that are looking into creating like very vintage film look, where you want that faded look, this is how you actually do it. Click on your black point and just raise it up. The higher you raise, the more faded it looks because you're just increasing the exposure of the black point. So if you want to make it crazy faded, just bring it up higher. But for me, I actually kind of grown tired of that look. I don't usually use that too much anymore. So bumping it up a little bit will do for me. And this looks good to me for now. I'm just increasing the contrast here. Okay, let's move on into the HSL tab. So what HSL stands for is your hue, saturation and luminance. If you use like this little dropper tool in the top left hand corner, right, it's a little trick where you can go into your image. You can just hover around any part of your image and Lightroom will recognize what color that is. So instead of just trying to mess around the colors and guessing what they are, you can use this little tool. And let's just say I want to change the color of this panel on the escalator here. I click on it and I can drag it up and down and it changes the hue of that color. So that's not what I want to do. I want to try and change the grid thingies on the escalator, just making it a little bit more orange like so. Okay, this looks good to me. So the image is kind of simple where we don't have a lot of colors going on. So we start with a simple image just to show you guys how I normally go through my basic workflow. And I'm going to try and speed things up a little bit. I don't want this tutorial to be too long. The blues kind of look a little bit distracting to me, so I'm just going to reduce the luminance. So luminance is the brightness and the brightness of your colors in your image. So reducing it and then just bumping the saturation down a little bit. This fits a lot more in the image for me. And the orange kind of stands out a bit too much for me right now, so I'm just going to reduce it a little bit. So you'll notice that as I edit, I'm not only strictly following like from the top all the way to the bottom. Sometimes when I'm going through like the edit, I realize that okay, the exposure kind of looks a little bit dark right now, and then I'll just go back and bump it up a little bit. Or if I feel the shadows need a little bit more boosting, I'll just go ahead and do that. And now that I brighten up the photo a little bit, I think I want to pump up the saturation in the escalator. Okay, so once that's done, we can move on to color grading. So in the later versions of Lightroom, you have this panel which is color grading. Before it was the split tone. So the difference is that in the color grading panel, you have more flexibility over controlling the shadows, midtones and highlights because there's a new addition to your split toning. Before, you can only control your shadows and your highlights and they're just sliders. So right now you just have a circle, the color wheel if you may, and you can control it like so. So for me, I usually like to add a little bit of blues into my shadow. So this is how I go about it. Play with the saturation a little bit. This looks good. And in the highlights, I would probably add a little bit more orange and yellows. And there's a reason why I'm doing blues in the shadows and orange in the highlights. So there's this theory called revolving around color theory, which is using complementary colors, and I'll emphasize on that in a future video. But just take note, like when you're editing photos, a lot of people use complementary colors in everything that they do. You can see it very evidently in movies nowadays, and some of you might know like the very famous teal and orange look. Might be a little bit cliche to some people, but for me, I kind of like that look as for now, so this is what I'm going to stick with. Okay, and I don't think I'll do anything in the midtones, but what I like to do is when I don't know exactly what I want to do in the image, I'll just play around with the sliders and see if there's anything that fits for me. As of now, this kind of looks okay. So maybe play with the saturation a little bit. And here's another little tip that you can do when you're editing in Lightroom. If you press on the keyboard Y, Lightroom will show you the before and after image, so you can always keep track of where you're heading towards and where you started from. Okay, so we're just gonna jump right back in. After color grading, we have detail. So when you're using a sharp lens and a high resolution camera, you typically don't need to do any sharpening involved here. So a little trick you can do is just to zoom in into your photos. And for me, I was shooting on a 1635 f2.8 Canon lens, which is I want to say one of my sharpest lenses that I've had. And everything looks kind of sharp to me, so I'm just gonna leave everything as it is. And we've already done lens corrections and transform. And under the effects tab, this is where you can add vignette to your photo. And I'm gonna show you how a little trick you can use to create more definition and create more interest in your photo. So when you're looking at an image, the eyes are naturally drawn to the brightest part of your image. So for me, in this particular photo, it is my friend at the bottom. And as you can see now, the exposure kind of looks very even throughout the photo. So I would say like, okay, it's interesting, but I can make it even more interesting. And this is how you do it in the effects tab. So you want to just drag the amount. And as you can see, it's like there's a slight vignette that's happening around the image. So what you are doing, or what I am doing, is just basically making the sides of the image darker. And once the viewers looking at this image, they're naturally drawn towards more at the center bottom of the frame, which is where I want the eyes to be directed to. So a little trick you can do also is to press Option on your keyboard if you're using a Mac, and you can just slide the midpoint and Lightroom will show you where it's affecting. Same goes to the roundness and the feather. So I'm just gonna do that real quick. Okay, this looks kind of great. Just before and after. Okay, that looks not bad. So we're pretty much done with the whole edit of the photo, and I'm not gonna go into the calibration panel because that's a little bit more advanced, and I'll leave that for a future tutorial when I'm going through more advanced tricks on Lightroom. So don't worry if this tutorial is a little bit too basic for you. I'll definitely be going through more advanced edits in the future. But for now, this is going to be it, and I hope you guys learned something here and there. If you have any questions, you can leave them in the comment section down below. And as always, if you haven't already, follow me on Instagram, that's at ryanmambasng. And you can always ask me questions on there as well. DM me, I reply to all my DMs. And yeah, I hope you guys will subscribe and like to this video. That gives me a lot of feedback and lets me know that you guys are interested in seeing more. I have a lot of things planned in the pipeline for this channel as well. There's going to be a lot more tutorials coming up, and it's not only going to be that, because I actually have a huge backlog of vlogs that I haven't even gone through yet from my travels of Faroe Island or even Thailand. So keep a lookout on that. And but for now, this is going to be it for me, and I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I'll see you guys in the next one.